a PhD candidate and USDA NIFA fellow at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. Her research focuses on ways in which farmers can strategically manage crop diversity for improved agricultural sustainability, particularly through the use of cover crops to support ecosystem services like nutrient cycling and climate resilience. She is passionate about collective learning, citizen science, and other participatory research approaches that engage the ag community in the creation and application of conservation knowledge. Etienne, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to hear your presentation.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, does everyone see that okay?
Yep, looks good.
Great. All right, so yeah, as Helen said, I'm a PhD candidate currently in the Soil and Agroecosystems Lab at the University of Michigan. And so today I'm presenting on a citizen science project that I've been working on as part of my dissertation aimed at improving our understanding of how and why cover crop performance varies across farms in the Great Lakes region. And I'm assuming if you're attending this meeting, you probably already know that cover crops do a lot of really wonderful things like building soil health, improving water quality, providing weed and pest control, the list goes on. But we also know from previous research that many of those benefits depend on cover crop biomass. So these figures show that ecosystem services like nitrogen retention, weed suppression, and nitrogen supply from legumes all increase with cover crop biomass across farms. The problem, though, is that there are a lot of different factors that can influence cover crop biomass, ranging from soil conditions to planting strategies to the amount of experience that a farmer might have with cover crops. So this means that even though a farmer might be aiming for something that looks like the photo on the left, they might still end up with something that looks like the one on the right, which then, of course, limits the environmental and economic benefits derived from that cover crop. So to address this problem, we developed a citizen science study in which we partnered with farmers from across the Great Lakes region to quantify variation in cover crop biomass across farms, identify key drivers of that variation, and then develop management recommendations based on our findings. And it's important to note here that there's already a lot of really great research going on trying to address this problem of how to optimize cover crop performance across different conditions, but there are also some major constraints to the most popular approaches. So for example, on-farm experiments are a great way to collect context-specific cover crop information and test different treatments, but traditional sampling techniques for biomass alone can be time-consuming, especially if you're studying multi-species mixtures. And this often means those experiments are limited to only a few treatments or sites, or perhaps even a single research station, depending on the level of sampling detail. And then on the other hand, remote sensing now offers a really exciting way to study conservation practices at large spatial scales. But the trade-off here is that you're usually not able to account for important management variables that can influence cover crop outcomes. And it's really difficult to detect exactly which species a farmer might be growing, which is important because we know that different cover crop species, like legumes versus grasses, excel at different functions and respond in different ways to their growing conditions. And then, of course, there are also more and more farmers combining multiple species into cover crop mixtures, which play an important role in increasing diversity on farms. So by using citizen science, which broadly refers to public participation in the research or scientific process, we developed an approach that helps address these constraints by working with farmers as our research partners to evaluate cover crop performance on their fields. So our citizen science approach involves two main components: an online management survey and a field assessment. The management survey asks questions about different factors that could influence cover crop growth. And then the field assessment is what allows us to quantify cover crop biomass across lots of different fields using just canopy cover photos and plant height measurements. So these two components together create a really rich data set conducive to studying relationships between a wide range of environmental and management factors and cover crop outcomes on working farms. So farmers complete the management survey online via Qualtrics, which takes an average of 20 to 30 minutes per field. The survey asked questions about how they managed their cover crop that season, including what species they planted, when they planted it, how they planted it, seeding rates, the preceding crop, and whether they applied any nutrient inputs to the cover crop or preceding crop. And then we also asked questions about their management system more broadly, which we use to calculate an ecological management index, or EMI, which places farms along a gradient from conventional practices to management based on ecological principles. So the index accounts for soil disturbance intensity through tillage, the proportion of the year with living soil cover, rotational diversity, cover crop history, and the use of organic amendments. And then for each field, we also have environmental data, including soil type, topography, and growing degree days and precipitation during the cover crop growing season. And then after farmers have completed the management survey, we ask them to visit their cover crop field shortly before termination in the spring to collect canopy cover photos and plant height measurements from 3 different locations in their field with representative biomass, which again takes about 20 to 30 minutes per field. The canopy cover photos are processed using a program called Foliage that calculates percent ground cover in each photo. And then we combine the percent cover number with cover crop height measurements to get an estimate of cover crop biomass in each field in kilograms per hectare or pounds per acre. The field assessment also asks questions, or it also asks for an estimate of weed pressure on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being really low, 5 being really high, which we can then use to basically apply a correction factor to account for weeds in the cover crop biomass estimates. And for mixtures, we had participants collect height measurements for each species, or just the 4 most dominant species if it contained more than 4. And then we also had them estimate sort of the relative proportion of each species so that we could calculate an abundance-weighted biomass value. And then finally, to ensure data quality and consistency, we also had participants view a demonstration video before performing the field assessment that included things like examples of different levels of weed pressure, like what's shown here on the right. And we also made sure to keep the protocol and instructions as clear and concise as possible. So this quick and low-cost field assessment method can predict cover crop biomass with accuracy comparable to, if not better than, current remote sensing approaches. So these figures show relationships between the field assessment metric on the x-axis and then observed biomass on the y-axis, measured using traditional destructive sampling techniques with a quadrat. So these relationships are specifically for cereal rye fields on the left, which is one of the most popular and reliable cover crops in the region, and then multi-species mixtures on the right. So these validation relationships mean that we're able to take the field assessment data a farmer sends us and convert it into a biomass estimate using the linear equations in the upper right corners of the graphs. And if you're interested in more details on how this protocol works, or you'd like to use it in your own work, we just published the full version online, and I'd be happy to share it with anyone who's interested. So to recruit farmers to participate in the study, we offered $50 per field for up to 2 fields, as well as personalized cover crop performance reports with biomass and nutrient composition estimates. We had quite a few farmers submit more than 2 fields, even though the maximum compensation amount was $100, because they found the performance report information really valuable. And we were able to provide compensation to participants through funding from the USDA, as well as the University of Michigan's Institute for Global Change Biology and the program in public scholarship. We also partnered with an organization called Michigan Agriculture Advancement on the recruitment and outreach components. The organization's founder is Dr. Tim Boring, who is now the director of the Michigan Department of Agriculture, and their current CEO is Dr. Julie Dahl, who has been involved in outreach and education across the Great Lakes region for nearly 2 decades now. So they were a huge help in terms of connecting us with growers, extension agents, and conservation professionals to spread the word about the project. And beyond that, I did a lot of emailing, phone calls, and presentations over the past couple of years to recruit farmers. So between spring 2022 and 2023, we partnered with 100 farms across the Great Lakes region to collect data on cover crop performance from 253 fields. Those farms are shown on the maps here, with stars denoting farms that we visited to collect biomass samples from to validate the field assessment protocol, the results of which you just saw a couple of slides ago. And during recruitment, we specifically asked farmers to include a cereal rye field if they had one, as well as a multi-species mixture, so that we could compare performance of the most popular cover crop species to that of mixtures, which can potentially be more difficult to manage, but also might offer a wider range of benefits. So in total, we ended up with 135 single species cover crop fields, 108 of which were cereal rye, and then 118 multi-species mixtures. To analyze this large data set, we first started by exploring descriptive statistics and then used a modeling approach called regression tree analysis, which takes a set of observations and then breaks it down into smaller and smaller subsets based on the relative importance of the explanatory variables included in the model. And this approach is well suited for this type of study because it produces results that are easy to interpret and directly relevant for management. So the figure here shows a simple example where age, weight, and exercise are used to determine heart attack risk. All right, so these graphs show the biomass results for 2022 on the top and 2023 on the bottom, specifically for cereal rye fields on the left and then mixtures on the right. We found that there was huge variation in cover crop biomass across the 253 study fields, ranging from virtually no biomass on some fields to nearly 12,000 kilograms per hectare on the best performing field. And this is encouraging on one hand because it means cover crops are working really well on some farms, but also means they're underperforming on a lot of farms and likely not providing environmental and economic benefits at meaningful levels. And you'll notice in general, biomass was lower in 2022 due to a really cold and wet spring, but warmer temperatures in 2023 contributed to higher biomass levels that year. We also found that mean biomass for mixture fields was roughly twice that of cereal rye in both years, suggesting that even though mixtures are sometimes considered a more advanced practice, farmers are successfully using them to accumulate substantial amounts of biomass. So these findings then beg the question, why was mean biomass so much higher for mixtures than for cereal rye? And when we dig into the data, we find a fairly straightforward story, beginning with rotational diversity. So when we break each cover crop type down by the preceding crop, we see that 90% of rye fields were planted following corn or soy, with only 10% planted following small grains, whereas nearly half of all mixtures were planted following a small grain. And because small grains are harvested in late summer rather than in fall like corn or soy, they provide a much longer cover crop growing window, and the warmer temperatures after small grains also means there's a much wider range of cover crop species to choose from than just cold tolerant species like rye. This rotation effect is reflected in the table here, showing that on average, cover crop mixtures had significantly more growing degree days and precipitation compared to rye, and were also planted roughly a month earlier on average. So this isn't to say that farmers shouldn't plant rye following corn or soy, but rather underscores the importance of rotational diversity for creating these really valuable windows for cover crop mixtures. Okay, so now that we've explored trends between the two types of cover crops, we can dig into the regression tree results that show strategies for maximizing cover crop biomass within each cover crop type. And so for cereal rye here, we found that growing degree days is the single most important parameter, which makes sense because rye is known for being reliable and robust. So as long as you give it long enough to grow, it will produce substantial biomass. And even though growing degree days is in part dictated by the weather in a given year, there are also a lot of ways that farmers can adjust their management to maximize cover crop growing degree days. Like by planting earlier in the fall, by interseeding or aerial planting, or by letting their cover crop grow longer into the spring, like we've been seeing a lot of no-till farmers start doing by planting green. And now the regression tree for mixtures is a bit more complex. So we found that mixture diversity, specifically species richness, was the most important factor. with precipitation then acting as a moderating factor. So overall, high diversity mixtures that received higher amounts of rainfall produced the most biomass. For low diversity mixtures, biomass was again moderated by precipitation, but also showed an important interaction with management. So fields with low precipitation that were able to produce were able to produce nearly twice as much biomass as the high precipitation fields if they had a history of ecologically based management, which suggests to us that ecological approaches to farming help buffer against challenging weather conditions and create more resilient systems. And then for fields with more conventional management, the next most important factor was soil type, with clay and loam soils associated with more biomass than other soil types. And so based on the mixture regression tree results, I want to spend another minute on the topic of mixture diversity. So when it comes to designing a cover crop mixture, there are often two questions that we hear farmers ask. So how much diversity do we need in the mixture? And then what kind of diversity? And the two graphs shown here represent different ways that we can measure and manage diversity, with species richness on the left, which is the total number of different species, and then functional diversity on the right, which is the number of different types of species with unique traits or characteristics. For example, a mixture with 3 different grass species would have a richness of 3, but a functional diversity score of 1. Whereas a mixture of a grass, legume, and a brassica species would have both a richness score of 3 and a functional diversity score of 3. And so in previous studies on cover crop mixtures, researchers found that functional diversity is often more important than species richness for maximizing mixture performance, because functionally diverse species tend to use resources more efficiently and excel at different functions. But we found that both approaches seem to have potential to increase overall mixture biomass, but it remains unclear based on the available data here whether the species richness relationship in particular continues sort of increasing linearly or might begin to taper off once we hit 7 or 8 species, potentially reflecting the point at which species become functionally redundant. Alternatively, the species richness result could reflect what's known as the insurance hypothesis in ecology, where having more species helps buffer against stressful growing conditions because the chances that at least a few species will perform well is higher than if you only had 1 grass, legume, and brassica species. So there's actually this insurance benefit to having redundant species in the mixture. And this might be especially important given that farmers face increasingly variable weather patterns, as we saw on the previous slide. So fields with low precipitation during the cover crop season were still able to perform reasonably well if they had high species richness, whereas fields with low species richness were not able to perform as well when they were water limited. So to summarize here, the fact that biomass was so variable across farms really underscores that just increasing adoption of conservation practices isn't necessarily enough. We need to partner with farmers to better understand how these practices are playing out on the ground and provide them with the support and resources to use those practices successfully. And then we also need to continue encouraging farmers to diversify their rotations, especially with small grains, which provide an ideal window for high biomass cover crop mixtures. And then when it comes to managing cover crops, there are always going to be factors out of the farmer's control, like the weather from year to year, but there are also a lot of factors within their control that can help increase cover crop biomass and associated benefits, like the timing and planting of termination, species selection and mixtures, and just greater experience with and reliance on ecologically based practices in general. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And I'll also add my contact info there in case that's helpful for anyone.
Great, thanks, Etienne. I think if we can go ahead and stop sharing there, we can start working through some of these questions. We had Handful of really good questions in chat. First one we had was if you will be sharing the protocol for estimating biomass using the foliage app.
Absolutely. So we just published that. It's on an open access website called protocols.io. And I'm happy to sort of, I don't know who it would be best to send the link for that to, but I'm happy to share that widely, and I would be thrilled to see it actually used on fields.
Great. And can you speak a little bit? I know there are different apps for measuring the amount of biomass above ground. Just your process for choosing one app over the other, if there was other apps you considered.
Yeah, so for estimating the biomass in this study, we weren't solely relying on an app. So the foliage app that I mentioned is just one component of the estimation process. It's just estimating the ground cover, which I think is in and of itself a really critical measure, especially if you're thinking about ecosystem services like erosion control and things like that. But when we look, like if you're trying to actually estimate biomass solely based on the percent ground cover, it's not capturing like the height of the cover crop. So that's why we developed this slightly more nuanced protocol that combines those two measures to create this more accurate calculation of cover crop biomass. And then, of course, there are sort of these traditional sampling approaches where you take this like square quadrat, you toss it on the ground, and you literally go out with scissors and clip everything, you dry it and weigh it. But that's pretty time intensive. And so this option was really nice because it's pretty quick, it's easy. All you need is a tape measure and a camera. And so it's really accessible and affordable for everyone to use.
Thank you. Another question we got was on what base temperature you were using for your rye GDUs.
So we used a base temperature of 32 for all of the cover crop species, just to sort of be conservative in those estimates.
Great. One just came in through now. Looks like if you can share more about the report that you provided to farmers, and did it have recommendations in it, best management practices, what all was in that report?
Absolutely. So the key thing that we were providing in those reports, like we tried to do pretty quick turnaround on that. So we distributed them, I guess it was in summer of this year. The first year of the study, it was a little bit later because we were still sort of trying to develop everything. But because it was quick turnaround, the main thing was just the biomass estimates for each farmer. So each field that they contributed to the study, we had an estimate for the biomass, and then we're able to provide a comparison of what that looked like in their field relative to all of the rest of the fields in the study. And we also gave them an estimate of the amount of nitrogen retained in their cover crop that year, and the potential C to N ratio based on the sort of like growth phase of the cover crop at termination. So those were the things that farmers, I think, found most exciting and useful, like data for their actual field. And then we included some preliminary results. We were a little bit hesitant to include too much because there's a lot of data analysis that needs to go into it. So this coming winter, we're going to be putting together slightly more comprehensive reports that include all of the like recommendations from the 2 full study years. So the reports they included like tidbits here and there of sort of like, what are our initial findings, but we wanted to wait until we had a little bit more data and time to analyze things to produce like a full report with extensive recommendations.
Building on that just a little bit, now going into, just several years of experience with this now, how has the project changed over time from year to year? Are you changing up your outreach strategy? Where do you see things going in the future?
Sure. So we're figuring that out right now. We're not planning to do another season of data collection this coming spring, but we're waiting on another cycle of funding that would allow us to sort of expand the project and work a little bit more closely with some of the farmers who have been collaborating with us over the past couple of years to update the surveys and sort of tailor it so that we're really getting at some of the things that farmers care the most about, like really honing in on planting and termination strategies and all of these different practices that are coming up, like the planting green component. So sort of trying to adjust the project as farmers are innovating on their farms. But that's a great question.
Let's see. We've got a question here from Lowell, and thanks for putting that in hectares for all of us, Lowell. It says, okay, first question was, what was the relevance of the 823 GDDs in the decision tree?
Yeah, great question there. So the way that the decision tree works is you input the entire data set, and the algorithm basically selects the point, for instance, for this variable growing degree days that explains the most variation. And so it says like 823 growing degree days seemed like an important cutoff point. So if you had beyond that, you seem to be on the higher end of biomass, versus if you're below that, you would be trending towards the lower end. And then it continues subdividing within that. And so it's not completely arbitrary. It's like the point that explains the most variation in biomass across the entire data set. And in terms of how many growing degree days to reach 1 milligram per hectare of cereal rye biomass, I would need to do a little bit of math on that to calculate. But that's a good question in terms of trying to translate these results into something that's actually meaningful to growers, which of course, yeah, we're hoping to do a bit more work on that before we send out the full report of management recommendations from the project.
Let's see, we've got a question here. If farmers reported their cash crop yields and if that had an impact on their overall, or if biomass influenced their overall yield.
Yeah, so that's something I wish we did have data on, but because of the timing of the survey, so we asked farmers to complete that management survey in the winter, like between January and March. And then they would sample their cover crop in the spring before termination. And so we didn't end up asking follow-up questions about yields or how they felt their cover crop affected yields. I think it would be a really interesting thing to ask, but it would require like additional surveying. And we're really trying not to ask too much of participants, since we're already, stealing a solid hour of their time just to include a field in the study. So, but yeah, that's a great question.
Let's see, we've got a good question here from Brett Roberts. He's asking, when you're looking at mixtures versus biomass, when you're looking at that full biomass picture, was it 1 or 2 species in the mixtures that were most responsible carrying the weight for that biomass?
Sure. So that's another thing on my to-do list, is sort of looking at mixture evenness, so the relative proportion of the species. I think that's very possible. Like when I was explaining that insurance hypothesis, if you have 1 or 2 species that do really well under those conditions, it definitely is. It's called this like selection effect, basically, where the fact that you happen to have those species in your mixture is what contributed to it performing really well. But again, just having more species overall increases the chances that you will have a couple of species that do well. But that's something we're definitely interested in looking more into. And there are a number of other papers that have come out recently as well, looking at sort of relationships between how evenly each of the different species are represented in the mixture and how that translates into actual ecosystem services. Like, does it matter that your species are sort of evenly represented or not? So, but yeah, wonderful question.
Looks like, so we've got one here on, typically a lot of our participants in this call are more on the farmer advisor side of things, right? Working with growers. And words like ecosystem services can be fun to throw at farmers. How are you defining that for farmers? How are you selling them on this project?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of times when I'm communicating these types of things with farmers, we're talking about things that are directly relevant for management on their farm. So the amount of nitrogen that's retained in the cover crop, because that's less that they need to be putting on via fertilizers. Talking about the amount of nitrogen that might be provided from legumes, so new nitrogen from the atmosphere, which again is a cost saving for them, as well as just the fact that having more biomass means you're contributing more carbon into the soil, which of course is a key component of soil health. And so sort of framing things through that lens, I found has been fairly effective. And also thinking in other work that I've been doing, we focus a lot on climate resilience. So thinking about how cover crops are building resilience to these variable weather patterns also seems to be a fairly big concern and seems to resonate with folks.
One question that I kind of came up with, I had watched another one of your presentations maybe from last year, and you had mentioned, I think offhand, just that you would, in this study, focused on above ground biomass, but I'm always interested in below ground. Have you done any work on below ground biomass?
Yes, a lot of work. So we have, it's sort of a complementary experiment. So this study that I just was talking about was purely observational. So looking at what farmers are already doing on their farms and focusing in on the above ground component. But we have an experiment that was done on 14 farms in Michigan, where we planted 3 different cover crop treatments. So a rye, crimson clover, and then a multifunctional mixture with 4 different species. And we dug up the roots in each of those treatments to figure out how much biomass the roots are contributing, how much nitrogen they're retaining, and then also looking at how soil conditions influence that. So the farms in the study spanned a gradient of management histories. So some had been under organic management for a couple of decades, and some were just beginning the transition. And so we had this really nice gradient where we can look at whether that gradient influences the amount of biomass that cover crops are allocating below ground versus above ground. So yes, hopefully we'll have some more results on that soon. But in general, we found that the mixture provided quite a bit more biomass and nitrogen across the fields.
How do we, is there a good way for us to follow that research? Is it the lab that you're working with? Is that a good way to keep up to date on that kind of stuff?
Yep. So we have a lab website. I'll type it here in the chat. There we go. So you're welcome to visit that. We post new papers that come out, as well as various studies that we have actively going on. So yeah, please do visit there. And you're welcome to send me an email or my advisor, Jennifer Blush. We're always happy to chat with people and get more folks involved in our research.
Awesome. Let's see. I'm not seeing any more questions. Well, actually, we've got something now just for from Lowell coming in. So Lowell's saying that we need one. I'm going to assume that's megagram. I'm not. Lowell's going to give me a hard time, I'm sure, about my metric units after this. But so megagram per hectare of cereal rye to reduce tile nitrate, and 3 per hectare, which is about 1.5 tons to reduce tile nitrate by about 50%. So he's, I guess, just wanting a follow up on what you find.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we haven't specifically measured nitrate leaching, but in general, we've been sort of using that same threshold. So 1 megagram per hectare of biomass to say, sort of like, this is the target really, because we know from other studies, and it sounds like from what Lowell has been working on as well, you really need to sort of hit that target level. Like if you're below that, you're really not getting benefits like reduced leaching and like nitrogen supply from legumes if you're below that threshold level. So yeah, I don't have sort of a direct answer in terms of nitrate leaching, but that's sort of how we've been approaching things.
Very cool. Yeah, I think that's all the questions that we've got. Again, if something comes in, we can be sure to share your contact information and have folks reach out to you. But no, again, we appreciate your time, and I'll pass it back to Helen.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Thanks, Etienne. Yeah, last call for questions. If people have any last burning ones to put into the chat, but I I think that was a great Q&A session. So yeah, lots of great answers, lots of great questions. Yeah, and we can transition to some updates that ICCON has that we'd like to share. We're excited to announce that we recently published a new resource that we're calling Digging Deeper with ISAP on cover crop mixes. This is kind of a result of our cover crop cocktails summer series that we did. And yeah, it includes a bunch of great information about some suggested mixes before corn, soybeans, and following small grains. I think Rachel is dropping the link to that in the chat. But you can find it on our website. It's a PDF that you can be printed. So if you're having a field day or looking for a nice 2-pager on cover crop mixes, yeah, it's a great resource. And if you have feedback on it, we're always open to hearing feedback about these things too. So yeah, that's that. And then I think the next slide, we're launching a survey within the network to hear about what people would like to get out of these calls, out of the Google group, how you're using this information within your own networks, and yeah, ways that we can improve topics that you're interested in hearing about. We did a similar survey about 1.5 years ago, so it feels like a good time to check back in, yeah, and just see what is on people's minds. So there's a QR code there on the screen that people can scan, and Rachel's also going to add the link to that in the chat. We'll be raffling off an ISAP cover crop t-shirt for anyone who submits before Thanksgiving. So that's your incentive to take the survey soon, and we'll follow up in the follow-up email with that information too. The survey will close December 15th, so after our next ICCON call. So there will be another reminder if you forget, but if you wait until then, no chance to get a cover crop t-shirt. So yeah, definitely take that soon. Yeah, if we go to the next slide. So upcoming dates and topics for ICCON calls in December, we'll look at the SARE study, I can never remember the acronym, Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. Any nods from Frank? They just conducted a study on cover crops too, so they'll be sharing recaps from that study. And then in January, we'll be joined by our friends at PCM, and they will give an overview of their business case for conservation, which came out this year. And as always, if people have suggestions for topics or speakers that you'd like to have us schedule in, we're always looking for suggestions. So from February and beyond. And yeah, they just wanted to open it up if anyone else had events or resources to share. Feel free to put them in the chat or come off mute and let them know. Oh, Corey's asking in the chat if he fills it out multiple times, better odds of getting a t-shirt. Good try, Corey, but no. We're asking if you fill it out, we're asking for you to, if you're interested in getting into the raffle for a t-shirt, we'll ask for your email. So then we'll be able to tell how many times you filled it out. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If there aren't other updates or things to share, we can wrap up a bit early here today. Give everybody 15 more minutes back of their Wednesday. So thanks everybody for joining. Oh, Rachel's adding in the chat. The Illinois Extension's hiring a watershed outreach coordinator, and that position is extended until November 22nd. So be sure to share that with your networks. She's dropping a link there in the chat, and Rachel, we can include that in the follow-up information too. And then, yeah, I think one other thing, Etienne, you mentioned, no, I can't remember what it was, but there was something to send as a follow-up, and we can be sure to, if you send that to Rachel, we can be sure to include that.
Yes, I did. I went ahead and pasted the link to the protocol in the chat, so people should have access to that now.
Okay. Awesome. Great. Well, yeah, thanks everybody, and we'll see you in December. Happy Thanksgiving.